Hi, everyone. One of the great things about population modeling is that it helps us to understand how humans can better interact with wild populations. And that includes through harvest. We rely absolutely on wild populations for so much of human civilization and for so many resources. This is one of the most important ecosystem services that we get is production of things that we can use. So we can ask a lot of things with population models. Things like how do we predict whether a population is going to survive? At what population size do we predict that that population is going to go extinct? And of course, we can use those population models to determine the largest number of individuals that we can take from a population for all sorts of human uses without causing damage to that population or threatening its continued existence. As we go through this talk, I want you to keep in mind a couple of ideas. There's always mortality in a population, right? As new individuals are being born, others are dying. When we intervene in a population, when humans cause some of that mortality, it can be done in a number of different ways. For example, it can be additive. So additive mortality occurs when human harvesting increases mortality above natural levels. So whatever's going on in that population, human harvesting adds to it. There's also compensatory mortality. And essentially what this is that whatever human harvest is going on, whatever human caused deaths are happening, those deaths are merely compensating for what would have happened otherwise. For example, if we've got a very large population close to carrying capacity and we skim off some of those individuals who would have starved, that's an example of compensatory mortality. And we can get back to that at the very end, where I'll show you a graph of what that might look like. Also keep in mind that for this presentation, we're dealing with fairly simple population models. A lot of harvest models could get more complicated than this very, very quickly. They could give us better information, but that also means that they're harder to manage. So we're going to start off with some really simple models to go through and think about how this works in populations. The other note that I wanted to make is that it's not just animals that this applies to. A lot of what I'm talking about has been developed in animals, has been applied to animal populations, but humans harvest other populations for a whole variety of uses. And one of those, of course, is in forestry. And in plants, there's even harvest of wild populations like echinacea, which is used in supplements that are purportedly helpful in managing colds and that sort of thing. And I won't get into the pharmacology of that or the reliability of those data, but that's something that we use those populations for. So let's go back to our basic model and rebuild that in our minds. A lot of times we look at these populations as growing over time. So we look at population size on the y-axis and time on the x. And here's our formula for that. You don't need to remember a lot of that at this point, but you do need to remember that k is our carrying capacity, n is our number in the population, t tells us where on that timeline we are, r is our intrinsic rate of growth, etc. So we're going to start out, like a lot of the illustrations of these models, at a very low n. So what I mean by that is our n sub 0, wherever we're starting looking at this population, we're going to do so very, very far from the carrying capacity. So most populations will start off and will exhibit something similar to exponential growth, right? That's a very rapid growth where the addition of individuals continues at that growth rate, but the number of individuals that are added in each time step increases. And I think you need to hold on to that idea. The rate is continuing the same, that r is not changing during the exponential growth, but the number of individuals that's added is. Eventually, there's some pressure from the environment, some other factors that are intrinsic to the population that push that population growth down, and we get the classic S-shaped logistic growth pattern. And we generally see that happening at carrying capacity. We know there are some exceptions to that. For example, rapidly growing populations can exceed carrying capacity. I want to reorient the way that you're looking at this graph. So we're going to take that y-axis and put it on the x. I'll give you just a second to imagine that. All right, so I'm going to move our original graph, the one that you should be familiar with at the beginning of this video, and reorient that. So we're going to put the population size, the n, on the x-axis. And on the y-axis, we're going to look at how much that population is changing in a given time step. So here's our exponential part of the growth. Here's where that levels off and we develop the logistic growth pattern. And the most individuals that we could take out of that population comes from this graph. This graph is what helps us to understand that. So at the very top end of this is K, the carrying capacity, and that's where our population is going to stop growing. Remember that we know that there are exceptions. We know that if it crosses K that there will be negative growth. Makes sense on this graph because you'll cross across the x-axis and the growth will be negative. Okay, so the most that we could ever take out of that population and allow it to still grow is referred to as the maximum sustained yield, MSY. And that occurs right about here. So that's the most individuals that that population is producing. And that occurs at halfway to carrying capacity. So I've added that vertical line to both the population size and to where we see that happening on the timeline. So in general, we see the maximum sustained yield in a basic population model like this at half of carrying capacity. That's where we're adding the most number of individuals per time step, and that's where we could take the most individuals per time step without threatening that population. So there are a number of ways that we can approach setting a harvest limit in populations. We could assign a fixed or a constant quota where we're going to take a certain number of individuals from that population. And so we have this predetermined harvest. These quotas tend to be difficult to set because we don't necessarily know what the population parameters are, and we don't know necessarily what the shape of this curve is. That makes it very difficult, and it tends towards overharvest. And I want to illustrate that for a minute. So here's a low quota harvest, right here. As long as we stay underneath that curve, we're going to continue adding individuals to that population. If we go above that curve, we'll push the population back down when the population is large. When the population is small, and we go above that blue curve, we're now going to push the population towards extinction because we're taking more individuals than it can produce. So there's also the risk that we could set our harvest rate well above that curve, and we could have a consistent overharvest from that population. So if we look at that, there are a couple of ways that we can modify that and do a little bit better job, be able to treat that population in ways that will allow it to sustain itself. There's the idea that we could exert fixed effort over time. So the idea is that the effort is consistent, but not necessarily the outcomes. So this should adjust to encounter rates, should adjust to the availability of individuals from that population. Um, and so if you spend 10,000 people hours hunting a particular population, then we would expect that at a large population size, those hunters are going to bring in more individuals to the hunted population. And at a small population size, they're going to have less success. It's a little bit more challenging to do a proportional harvest, but we could say that 20% of the population, we can allow that to be taken. So you need a lot of population information. You don't make quite as many assumptions, but you need more information because you're no longer making assumptions. And so both of these approaches behave in a similar way. There's another idea that adjusts in the sense that there's a certain proportion of the population that must escape each time that population's harvested, whether that's fishing or hunting or timber harvest or digging echinacea or whatever, that a certain proportion of the individuals would escape that harvest event. And that's the safest way to approach it, to make sure that you've always got that population that will allow it to build itself back up. Fixed effort harvest, proportional harvest don't necessarily guarantee us that, but in all cases, they work better than that constant harvest. One of the reasons for that is that if we have those harvest types and we're taking a proportion of that population, either based on effort or based on a known proportion of the population, it's likely that we're going to go through a point on the graph where that's going to be a stable interaction. So if we have it just right, it can go through the maximum sustained yield. So as we harvest below that, we take a small proportion and the population grows towards the maximum sustained yield. And then if we harvest above that, the population shrinks towards the maximum sustained yield, and we're getting the most that we can out of that wild population. There are possibilities to set that too high. And if we set it lower, no harm, because that population is not harvested maximally, but the dynamics of the population are such that it continues to replace those individuals and to maintain that population. So overharvest is still possible, but we could sort of build in a margin of error, either intentionally or unintentionally. There are other approaches to harvest that I think are worth considering, and one of those is that we could adaptively harvest populations. So if we knew, for example, that population is likely to go over the carrying capacity and then to crash back under, we know that a number of those individuals are going to be lost from that population anyway. Now we can start considering a compensatory approach where we're taking individuals who are going to die, or we're taking individuals that we're not going to reproduce anyway. And so that, in a lot of ways, is a more appealing approach and might help us to maintain other aspects of the population in the ecological community that it exists. So we can think about these approaches called adaptive harvest management. This is one approach that I'm showing you here, but there are other ways that we could do adaptive harvest management. And the idea is that there's a constant reinformation. So we're not just setting it, there's not a set it and forget it approach. We're constantly collecting information from that population, going back and recalibrating the number of individuals that can be taken. This is typical for sustainable fisheries. Some of the sustainable hunting that's done is based on an adaptive harvest management approach. There are other things that you should be aware of in the sense that we could adjust this to population structure. So we could focus that harvest even more intentionally to cause compensatory mortality, to take out individuals that are already lost or are already going to be lost from that population. You could focus on old individuals who are likely in senescence, who are already out of the breeding population, who may already be dying, individuals that are at high risk of mortality, maybe young individuals in other populations that are very likely to be at risk of not surviving. And of course, all of those have other implications in the ecological community and in the context of that population. So it's not maybe as simple as it sounds as I go through it here, but you get at least the underlying framework. And in other cases, we could simply protect those individuals that have the highest fecundity, that are the highest likelihood to contribute significantly to that population's growth in future. In a lot of cases, that requires that we have a much more complicated model. It might mean that we're less certain. It might mean that we take more parameters. So there are some trade-offs to implementing models like that, but in a lot of ways, we can do a better job of managing those populations. So, thank you for thinking about this with me. I hope that that helps, and you can check out my next video. We will look at how to pull those harvest ideas into a spreadsheet model. Have a great afternoon. Thank you for joining me.